inputs here, but we have a pretty big drawdown when we do this kind of stream. That way we just
Yeah, but I just put it on airplane mode, so hopefully it'll.
I'm looking for title stereotypical. Well, good day to you. I'm Bobby Hill. I'm the International Director of Vanguard Ministries. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a live-streamed event. It is a webinar that we have now dubbed the ISI Training Equipping Webinar Series. And we're pleased to quarterly be able to provide for you what is designed to be helpful, equipping, informative, relevant topics that will make a difference in your life as a leader. We want to always make this available to as many people as possible, and so from this day forward, we will continue to have this webinar available on our Vanguard Ministries media YouTube channel. So please tell your friends and neighbors. They don't need to register for it. There is no cost or charge. We would just love for them to benefit from the content. So today we've picked a topic that we believe is compelling and relevant, maybe more than any other time in our past, particularly as pastors, as ministry leaders of all kinds, as elders and teachers and missionaries and worship leaders. We want to talk today about mental health and the local church. I don't need to tell you the last 18 months has raised this subject level to an all-time high interest. And we as church leaders and ministry leaders need to pay attention. So today we've invited two guests to come and present from their perspective, and by design, different perspectives on the subject of mental health in the local church. And each of them will share with you. I'll introduce them momentarily. And then we'll have a brief 60-second break with a commercial. We'll come right back with a panel, and we'll enjoy taking your questions. This is designed to be interactive. So please take note of the chat feature on your YouTube channel, and you're welcome to type in comments or questions or say, Bobby, we love your look today. Whatever you'd like to say is just fine. We welcome all your comments and questions seriously. And we like to know at the end, we'd like to know if we're doing well and if this is really hitting the target, and that's really important for us. So let me introduce our guest. First is going to be Cron Gibson, and he is the founder and the director of HopeWell Counseling Center, Equipping Center, which does a number of things, and we'll try to give a little bit fuller introduction to him even at the panel stage as we introduce an additional guest. But Cron is going to come. He's trained as a professional counselor. He's also been a church planter and works with church leaders in many different regards. So Cron is going to come and share first, and immediately following him will be Pastor Steve Morgan, who pastors the Bridge Christian Fellowship in Chesapeake, Virginia. So he will come from a pastoral perspective, and I think following that, we're going to have plenty of questions that our panel can handle together. So would you welcome with me this morning, Cron Gibson. Cron, come and share with us this morning.
And you really are good looking, like what you're wearing. Good. It's good to connect with you all today. I thought maybe I'd start with a little bit about me because it gives a context to where I want to go with you. I started HopeWell Counseling Ministries in 2010, but my story starts a long time before that. We're speaking about mental health in the church. I grew up in an environment of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. I've been through 6 major depressions in my life. I've been a professional Christian in U.S. culture since 1990. My wife and I served with Campus Crusade for Christ for 7 years, doing campus ministry in New York, New England. I've been a part, as Bobby said, of church planting. My wife and I have planted 3 churches. I'm ordained in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. And what I do for a living anymore, or my calling, I suppose, is I operate HopeWell Counseling Ministries. Our mission is to offer the present hope of Jesus to hurt and wounded people in partnership with a local church. Out of that, I've ended up over the years doing a whole lot of coaching of church planters, providing counseling to pastors. And every year, as I'm sure you know, as Bobby just mentioned, in culture, the water gets deeper, the brokenness we're seeing becomes more overt. And the question becomes, in my mind, how does gospel touch mental health? How does mental health relate to gospel, or the other way around? The difficulty when we think about mental health, though, is this: you can't see it. If I pulled my pant leg up for you, in addition to probably terrifying you, I could show you an inseam on my knee that once upon a time had 82 staples in it. I had a knee replacement when I was 56. If I'm your neighbor and I'm helping you in the yard and you ask me to crawl under a bush and grab something you dropped, I will say no. But you can see the scar on my knee and understand why. It's right there. When it comes to mental health, we don't see a scar on a person's head, on their face, yet it's there. It's not something about just believing better. We can show with various kinds of tools now, a neurofeedback measure of brain waves, PET scans, we can show how the brain is impacted by depression, anxiety, PTSD. Now, having said that, it's also really incomplete to say, let's blame it on the brain, and if we just fix a piece of chemistry, life will be good. That's insufficient. In my mind, that's a lot like an alcoholic gets sober, but their life never changes, so they continue to act the part of the addict, destructive across the board in their life. And God intends far more for you and me than that. Over the last 2 years, the impact of the pandemic has been vast, has destroyed, broken, and continues to. According to the CDC and the National Institutes of Mental Health, 2 years ago, June 2019, 1 out of 10 Americans identified the symptoms of depression or anxiety in their life. June 2021, 40% of Americans. Now that's subjective reports. I personally tend to think where there's a subjective report, the reality of the report is probably worse. Now you can also take those numbers and look at addiction, suicidality, and all of the numbers are leaping. What I would suggest to you is all of these things have something in common. And my desire today for you, as you listen, is to give you a framework to think about what you're seeing, and more so, as a pastor who happens to be clinically trained, to invite you to wrestle with how you live. Have you addressed your own broken things? Because friends, if we haven't, I may declare the grace of God richly, but what my life will model, what my people will catch, is something entirely different. You and I, as church leaders or counselors, we are not objects in a system to help others be better. Jesus sees us as his, and he has desire for you and for me, our homes, our marriages, to be permeated with the liberty of the gospel in a way that frees us to live vulnerably with him, ourselves, and each other, which is the ground, the lack of that, the ground of the vast majority of mental nervous disorders. So let me give you a framework. I'm going to walk through the scriptures doing it, and I'll point out how it relates to the mind and theory as we go along. First thing I would just start with, you can see on your screen, I've just titled this message, Created Needy. Now, if we're honest, none of us likes the word needy. If I met you at a coffee shop, I'm talking to a friend, you walk up, you know my friend, sit down, we chat for a few minutes, and I look at you and I go, hey, you know you're needy, right? Gut reaction is, why'd you say that to me? Needy's a bad word, but needy is a creational notion. In Genesis 2:18, God looks at Adam, and he says, Adam, it is not good for you to be alone. Little irony in the biblical Hebrew is the word alone is pronounced bad in English. It means to be separated, isolated. So I want to hold this idea with you for a minute. It's a misnomer when we subtly teach, or sometimes not so subtly, hey, struggling person, you just need Jesus. You just need to trust him more. Because that message becomes a message of, go try harder. If you would believe better, if you could perform right, you could have the safe, secure, attached connectedness you're designed for. But the law, the rules, performance can only generate more isolation. What I want to catch you with right here, though, is this. Again, God looked at Adam. Perfect faith. Sin hasn't entered yet. And he says to Adam, hey, Adam, you need something in addition to me. I've created you for something in addition to me that also, by the way, reflects the relational design of our Trinitarian God. So we pick up the next piece of it, familiar passages. We realize perfect humanity is needy humanity. And then we go to the end of Genesis 2, and the man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. Now the idea here is this: there's nothing concealed, exposed, it's all open. It's not, I'm undressed, but there's no disguise. It's a perfect, vulnerable relationship. No hiddenness needed with the one who made us, with ourselves, and with the other. In psychological language, we would describe that as perfect, secure attachment. It is what you and I are designed to have, to live out of. And it is the very thing that is shattered across humanity and cultures. So I want to say this to you one more time. Neediness, friends, is creational. Most of us, by that I mean there may be an exception somewhere, most of us are profoundly at war with our neediness. A silly illustration. I'll pick on Bobby for a minute. Let's say Bobby doesn't know me and he shows up at my office seeking help. And I go, hey, Bobby, I can tell you're feeling a little nervous today. It's a scary thing to sit with a counselor and be invited to kind of take your emotional clothes off and not hide. And it's okay to be anxious because it's a scary place. But let me make it normal or normalize it for you, Bobby. Let's say you had to do one of two things in the next 5 minutes or you're going to die. But you're going to have to pick one or death is coming. So I say to Bobby, hey, Bobby, I've got 10 people out in my lobby. You're going to know 5 of them. You won't know 5 of them. You have to go out, choice 1, to the lobby, and you have to strip emotionally absolutely naked. There is no part of you get to hide. No little sin, big sin, all the darkness in you has to be revealed. Or, there's gravel in the parking lot so you can keep your shoes on. You can take a physical naked lap around the parking lot and come back in. But you have to choose one of these or you're going to die. Now, if we get honest for a minute, most people, I would say, hold the door, I'll be right back. Now, why? Because embedded in all of us is a certainty that if I reveal me, it will not go well. That is called shame, intrinsic in humanity. It is the tool of what sin does that propels an isolation that undermines all of our lives, emotionally, relationally, mentally, spiritually. If you were tonight to pick up the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, it is this thick. It is the Bible of all things mental nervous diagnoses. Most of you have it by your toilet, I'm sure, and you read it in the evening when you can't sleep. It's a lot like the American tax code. But as you would turn the pages and read the fine print, the vast majority of the things we diagnose are built on ruptured attachment. They're built on the lack of secure connection. They're built on the outcome of what shame and developmental brokenness has created in all of us. There are things that's not the case in schizophrenia. There are things that are truly just chemical, just biological. The vast majority of things, however, flow out of these ruptures. That's why even in the counseling world, we know that the most meaningful part of the healing journey is how the person in the room experiences the relationship with their counselor. Here, created to be naked and unashamed. Now the problem is this. Genesis 3:10, there's a shift in the language. I was afraid, says Adam to God, when God says, where are you? Because I was naked, and so I hid. Now let me stop with this for a minute. As people in the ministry, very familiar passage. It's important, though, to process this. I was afraid. So the first word in the Hebrew text out of Adam's mouth after sin has entered is yareh, afraid. And it's not like, hey, I feel a little nervous right now. I'm afraid. I'm now naked. Naked is a different word than it was before. It communicates the exposure of the brokenness. It's about shame and guilt. And so I hid. And the word hid is only used 30 times in the Hebrew Old Testament, 25 times meaning the fear of death. And that's what's happening here. So let's back up. Adam is created for perfect, secure, intimate relationship with God, himself, and other, as is Eve. Now, something else has happened. There's a reactive cycle that has come upon him. 1 minute, alone was not good. Shame has come, and we begin to believe that alone, masked, isolated, is good. And right there, death finds a way in. For the wages of sin is death isn't just a vertical thing. We experience it internally, and we experience it with each other. The thing I want you to catch here is this. Here's what the text is modeling. Adam says, afraid, because I was naked, so I hid. So here's this difficult feeling. Here's the belief that's attached to it. Naked, I'm bad inside. And a behavior, so I hid. Feel, think, do. In modern language, when we talk about trauma, or we have a person's head plugged into a PET scan when they're reactive, how does the brain fire? The emotional centers fire off. It corresponds to beliefs, I'm not safe, I'm not good enough, I'm going to get hurt, I'm going to be exposed, and so I hide. Feel, think, do. That cycle moves about 30 times faster than you and I can actually think. Now, if we back up a step and we take a stereotypical implied teaching that is often present in the church, and we ask a question. What is more marked or damaged by the fall of man? Our feelings or our thinkings? Most people will think, well, it's got to be my emotions. They're the screwed up part. When actually, my feelings go here. What I've learned they mean, feel, think, is what destroys me. It is where I end up hidden. And it is the ground again of where depression, anxiety, addiction come in. If you speak to a person struggling with one of these, ask them a question. How often do you feel alone inside? They will tell you it is at the core of everything. Getting away from that desperate aloneness. Not having to feel it. Trying to manage it. And again, this is the root of mental illness. So now we can jump over for a moment and we think about the pandemic we live in. What has this done to us? It has propelled all of us into a crazy radical form of isolation, aloneness, that is brutally undermining to our mental health, our emotional well-being, our ability to connect well with others, with God, etc. Because alone and isolation is the course of death for all of us. So when we sit with this, I'm trying to articulate to you, we go to war with our own neediness. Now, friends, I want to be honest with you for a minute. I'm a pastor. As I said before, I've planted churches. I've been associate pastor. I understand myself and what I do today. I'm a pastor who happens to be clinically trained. My counselor experience and education is just fodder, helps me understand how change happens. So I can articulate all of these things to you, but I would rather go take a naked lap around the parking lot, quite honestly, than really be vulnerable and own the neediness. Now, why is this important? Because if you and I are not allowed to be needy, we cannot ever be connected. The way God intended and created us, neediness is the ground of all of our connectedness. Pastors, leaders, when we teach people they need to believe better, I'm not arguing that there's not a poverty of faith, but when we teach them if they would just believe better, they wouldn't have this emotional turmoil. We reinforce it's not okay for you to be you where you are. Go try harder. In simple language, we're very prone to want to say, if you would just think right and do right, life would come, mental health would be good. But again, path of destruction, because the focus becomes, am I doing it right? Am I thinking about it right? Am I performing right? Backtrack into mental health. As a survivor, multiple major depressions. I worked for Campus Crusade. I was the director at Cornell University in years gone by. My own wheels came off. All the trauma I grew up with caught up with me. I was teaching at the time through Galatians, the very heart of the good news. But it became a weapon in my depression because I couldn't believe it for myself. Because what was happening in my body was in the way of my ability to be emotionally and cognitively anchored in what I knew was true. Well-meaning friends at the time came along, pastors around me, people in the ministry, and said, Cron, you just need to do this. Put yourself on a schedule, get up, do things, keep moving, don't stop. Which became more darkness, more never enough, more never good enough, because it mirrored the voice of shame and depression that was in me. I want to back up a step again. Why am I doing this with you today? Because, church leader, pastor, counselor, if you don't know, it is okay, necessary even, for you to own your own neediness. That Jesus provides a path for you to be vulnerable, a path to build and begin to know more and more secure attachment, safety with others that translates internally to safety inside. You will simply be helping people rearrange the furniture or making it worse for them. When I was in seminary, my homiletics professor one day, I've always been willing to share my story. After I had preached a sermon in class, said this to me, hey, Cron, you might not want to share anything personal. The people in your church are going to want to be able to know you're a little more holy than they are. Wow. Which I appreciated the candor of, but even then, that was just a couple of days ago in my life, I thought, well, my churches are really going to be screwed up because I got nothing on being more holy. But friends, we know that pressure to mask. The ministry gives us little permission to be what we actually are. 73% of pastors say they have one friend in the local church. It's their spouse. 92% of pastors' spouses say they have no friends in the local church. So in my case, I feel pressure. I get junk in the church. The ministry, the church is the only place really where crap rolls uphill. I struggle with it. I can go home and complain to my wife, Elizabeth. Other people, because she's the pastor's wife, complain. She hears snippy things, but she has nowhere to go. And isolation begins to be reinforced in the clergy life. And as we buy that, it is at odds with what God says I've created you for. And as I buy that, I actually propagate spiritual, emotional, and mental unhealth. Because what I model, what people catch, is how they understand the gospel, not what I say nearly so much. And so I say to you, friends, help in the mental health world in your church starts with you. Is it okay for you to be needy? Can you sit down with your elders or your deacons, however your church is governed, Are you allowed to say, I'm really struggling, guys, pray for me? If you're not, you're at odds with God, and you are propagating the culture of isolation that the pandemic has poured Miracle Grow on, leaving you more desperate, and the people to whom you minister more desperate themselves. So let me walk across a couple of more pieces. What does Jesus do with his turmoil? In Matthew 26, I'll just paraphrase this. Matthew quotes Jesus first, speaks of Jesus, describes him. He could see that Jesus was overwhelmed and distressed. So it's on Jesus. Now remember, he's the God-man. Perfect faith, profound emotional turmoil. Put those together with me. Believing better isn't the issue. Profound emotional turmoil goes in the moment. But let's look at what Jesus does with it as a picture. And this at its root is what is going to happen simply in any counseling journey also. Next verse, Matthew quotes Jesus. Perfect faith allows Jesus to own where he is because he knows the Father sees him. My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. And then what does he do? I should go isolate myself and work that out so I can believe better. No. First thing he does isn't even actually talk to God. He turns to his closest friends and says, guys, be with me. And then he prays. Now, why does Jesus do that? Because Jesus was present in Eden, and he knows in our humanness what we are created for and what we desperately need. And he models a faith position as he trusts his Father to own his difficult emotions and knows that they mean step into relationship, honest with self, honest with others, inviting connection, and wrestling it with the Father. So I circle these ideas with you, again this way. You and I are created for secure attachment, deep, intimate connection. I remember listening to a man named Henry Cloud, a prolific Christian counselor, psychologist, writer, saying in a small group teaching a million years ago I was in, that it is very difficult to find a depressed person who is deeply securely attached to others. Because this is what God has intended, and depression is just a taste of death as we sit in the isolation. Depression looks backwards and is trapped. Anxiety looks forward and says, I'm not going to be okay. Either position sits in the isolation. But Jesus models what we're intended for and what sound psychology knows we have to have. The stepping into, even in our turmoil, intimate, vulnerable, safe relationship. And the picture here is helpful this way. Jesus knows what it is to be invisible to the people he asks for help as they go to sleep on him. So he understands, even as he lays a picture for the pathway for mental, emotional, and spiritual health, that the ministry, typically the church, the counseling office, doesn't really give us permission for. Let me close with this. One of my favorite stories out of the New Testament. It's a picture, and this is how you can help people in your church with mental health. It's the story of the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. She's thinking to herself in the verses prior to this, if I just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be okay. In the culture, she's been unclean because of her bleeding. She's been outcast, disconnected, unacceptable because there's something wrong with her. And so normatively, we can understand it. She thinks if I touch the hem of his garment, I'll be cleaned, I'll quit bleeding, and then I can be okay. So that's what she does. But Jesus, and when she does it, Jesus stops in the crowd and he says, someone touched me. I perceive power has gone out from me. And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, pause. Jesus is in a crowd. How does she know she's not hidden? The only thing my imagination can come up with is because in the middle of a crowd, Jesus is going, I see you. You touched me. And watch the transaction. She comes trembling before him and falls down and declared in the presence of all people why she touched him. She explains her shame. She explains her brokenness. She's out of hiding. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." But Jesus is speaking to something much more profound than just her body is healed. This woman had been invisible for the years of this problem. What she deeply needed was to know that she was seen, that she was heard, that the isolation of shame, the tool of sin, was broken. And she was made whole. Friends, as pastors, leaders, this is a primary profound gift we can learn to give to people who are struggling. They need to be seen, but we have to start with you and me. I need to be known and seen. And as I get that picture from the Lord, my mental health will change also, because it will propel me into whole relationships that I am intended to have, and that sound psychology simply agrees with what God has already said. Thank you for your time.
Cron, thank you so much for all that you've shared this morning. There we go. Well, Cron, we appreciate everything that you have shared with us this morning, and thank you for sharing some of your own personal story, which made what you shared all the richer. Just as a segue, I remember having a conversation a few years ago with someone who had spent a number of years in the homeless life, and what they said to me was that most of the time they just never felt seen. That sometimes with homelessness, we have a tendency not to make eye contact with the homeless person because we're afraid we're going to be asked for something and we're not quite sure how to respond, and so we just avert our attention. And the result is that person is not seen. And so thank you for reminding us that those who are struggling, including ourselves, perhaps one of the most precious gifts we can give is just acknowledging that they're a person and that they are seen and that they're valuable to us and to the Lord. Well, my name is Steve Morgan, and I do pastor the Bridge Christian Fellowship in Chesapeake, Virginia. I want to just say hi to all of my Vanguard friends out there. Thanks for tuning in to today's webinar. Give a shout out to my folks from the Bridge Christian Fellowship, and particularly those who have been recently in a mental health discussion group at our church. Glad that you are joining us as well. You know, this issue of mental health is a real thing. There is an iconic 19th century pastor and theologian, Charles Spurgeon, who was in his day referred to as the Prince of Preachers, and this is what he had to say about his own life. He said, "The flesh can bear only a certain number of wounds and no more, but the soul can bleed in 10,000 ways and die over and over again each hour." And so these are obviously the words coming from someone who intimately understood the pain of depression even in his own life. And it's a reminder that people of faith can struggle with mental and emotional suffering. We're not immune from that. In fact, we see the psalmist cry out in Psalm 88, verse 18, "Darkness is my only friend." And there have been times in my life, in moments where I have felt the pain of the isolation that Cron was talking about, where the only friend that I felt that I had was the darkness that was surrounding me. And do you know that there are many people in our churches who are struggling with this sort of ongoing sense of loneliness and despair? You know, Katie and I have been married for 38 years. We have 5 incredible children. It's been our privilege as their parents to walk with some of them through their own mental health journey, dealing with things like anxiety and depression and the tyranny of compulsive thoughts. We're so proud of them for pressing into their community and to the Lord and finding a way to flourish even in the midst of some of these difficult mental health challenges. As a pastor of 36 years, I've spent time listening to and praying with countless numbers of people over the years in my congregation who have suffered and been isolated by mental health issues. And so you would think, based on my family experience, you would think based on my many years of pastoral experience, that I would feel qualified for the challenge of understanding as a pastor how to lead my local church into the place of ministering well to those who are struggling within our church and in our community surrounding our church with mental health issues. But my confession to you today is that I don't feel terribly qualified. I realize that there is still so much that I am learning and understanding about my role as a pastor in mobilizing the local church to be a caring community to those who are struggling with mental health issues. You know, just a few years ago, I came up very short trying to understand and support a staff member that was on our church who had received a very difficult mental health diagnosis. And we tried to offer a level of support that was meaningful to the person, and we frankly fell short. And I have felt the pain of that, and it's been a part of my own personal wrestling and understanding, God, now how do you desire for me to move forward in understanding how to minister in the context that you've placed me with those who have mental health difficulties. You know, dealing with mental health concerns, like a chronic condition, isn't easy. It's not easy for the person who's experiencing it. Many times they feel like the diagnosis they've received has defined their life, that people only see them through the lens of that diagnosis. And for those of us who are seeking to give support to those who are struggling with mental health, it can be terribly overwhelming. We're feeling challenged in ways that we just may not feel like we can rise to the challenge of. And so we see this reflected actually in a recent Lifeway study that found that pastors and churches really do want to help those who are experiencing mental illness, but those good intentions don't always actually lead to effective ministry. And so among the findings of this Lifeway research, we find that most Protestant senior pastors, about 66% according to the research, seldom speak to their congregations about mental illness. About a quarter of pastors, that's 22%, admit to being reluctant to help those who suffer from acute mental illness because of the time that's involved. And I've certainly experienced that in my own life. And if you've been involved in church leadership or pastoral ministry, you know that there are times when you face situations that people are walking through that are incredibly demanding upon your time and figuring out how to juggle that and to make sense of it. And then finally, family members in the research indicated 65% of them, and even those with mental illness, 59%, would like their church to talk more openly about mental illness so that the topic is no longer taboo. And most of our churches, what I'm discovering, including my own, have been missing the chance to minister effectively to those with mental illness or who are struggling through mental health issues. And so the question this morning that I'm asking is, what can we do? And I'm certainly no expert, and I'm in the process of learning myself. I've tried to really become a student of the subject over the last several months as the Lord stirred in my spirit back in May of this year that this was an issue that he was calling my attention to. And the first thing that I would share with us as church leaders, as pastors, as missionaries, if you're responsible for caring for the lives of others, the first thing that we need to be reminded of is that we've got to view mental health issues holistically. Much of the stigma that is related to mental health begins with the notion that somehow the spiritual, that the mental health anguish that a person is experiencing, that suffering, is just the result of a spiritual problem, that there isn't anything else that's really going on. There's an author and theologian named John Swinton who interviewed a large number of people with mental health diagnoses. He wrote a book that contains his findings along with some other observations called Finding Jesus in the Storm. And in an interview concerning his book, he said this: almost everybody that I spoke to, and I spoke to over 80 in total, said to me that they had experienced where a Christian or a Christian community had told them that their situation was a result of either a sin or the demonic, and that was deeply distressful. Well, you can imagine that that would be deeply distressful if the sum total of your issue, the problem, the thing that you're struggling with, is just so easily dismissed into one of these categories. Now, I do want to say that we certainly can bring trouble on ourselves through our own sinful choices. There's no question about that. And within the Vanguard family of churches and those who are a part of Vanguard around the world, you know that we embrace the full work of the Holy Spirit. We recognize that there is a spirit realm. There is a demonic realm that needs to be dealt with. And certainly we should not live in denial of that. But we also need to recognize that sometimes people are struggling in life due to physiological or psychological disabilities that are beyond their control. That is not rooted in sin or even in something demonic. So instead of assuming that every mental health problem is only a spiritual problem, we must develop a biblical framework for kind of a holistic view of mental health that encourages and empowers people to focus on their spiritual life, their emotional life, and their physical health. Body, soul, spirit, we're an integrated being, and we need to encourage people to find wholeness in every area of their life. The second thing that I'm learning in response as a local church to the mental health issues that face us is that we need to make mental health a part of our regular conversation. And, you know, pastors, every time you step into your pulpit, you have the opportunity to break stigma concerning mental illness. Because when we address it from the pulpit, when it becomes a part of our normative language as we're communicating with our people, we're teaching them that every person in our congregation, including those who have mental health diagnoses or are struggling with some mental health issue, is valuable and important. We're recognizing them as a part of our family and that we care. And so what would happen if we actually started to ask, I think I'm going to initiate this at some point in our ministry at the Bridge, but what if in the preparation of sermons occasionally I reached out to someone in my congregation who I know has been in a journey of health and wholeness and mental health. What if I asked them to help me understand how to craft messages and what language I could use within those messages that would be sensitive to those in our community that are struggling with mental health issues? We might start addressing topics like joy and happiness and victory in a little bit different way than what we have before, acknowledging that there is some lament to the Christian life, that we do live in a fallen, sinful world. There are difficult things that happen to all of us, and we have to be able to embrace those seasons as well as hoping for the joy and the victory that can be on the other side. And so we have this opportunity to lead the way in using appropriate, empathetic language that creates a life-giving environment that grants permission to the whole church to begin to talk in constructive ways about mental health. And so one of the things that I recently heard a pastor share is that they actually once or twice a year have a mental health Sunday where they invite testimonies of those who have been on a mental health journey to wholeness and who are brave enough to share their testimonies and to talk about their real life experiences. As Cron was sharing, to take a moment and to pull back the veil. And when you're brave enough and courageous enough to do that in an environment of safety, it's so healing. Not only the person who's sharing, but to those who are receiving as well. And they also choose to invite once a year a mental health professional as a guest speaker, someone who can come and share, like, for instance, Cron did today, not only the spiritual substance of what's happening, but also relate to us some more clinical understanding so that we're addressing the whole issue. We're addressing the issue holistically. The third thing that I would share as a strategy, perhaps, for local church to effectively minister to those with mental health issues is that we need to begin to offer biblically sound mental health education. Much of the misconception regarding mental health, honestly, is just steeped in our own ignorance. It's like I didn't realize how little I knew about the issue or how little I had cared to even invest myself in understanding issues regarding mental health until I started to be confronted with some of these issues, even within my own family. When I began to see that there were those who I had been given charge over as a pastor to care for the souls of these people that God had given to me, and seeing them struggle through these things, and I thought, why have I not made more of an effort to be a student of this and to educate myself? And so I encourage church leaders, pastors, just start reading, start educating yourself, start having conversations with mental health professionals, and begin to build your own understanding of the issues that surround mental health. And then we can combat the ignorance that perhaps may be present in our churches by educating our congregation. At the Bridge, we've just taken a group of people in our church family through a mental health curriculum called the Sanctuary Course. And it's a Canadian-based ministry and curriculum. It's 8 weeks in length. And over the course of the 8 weeks, we learned some really important things together. Like, for instance, we learned that all of us have mental health that needs to be cared for. All of us do. And that we all fit on a continuum, from those who are flourishing to those who are languishing. And so there are challenges that we all face, and understanding that we're all in the same boat together is an important understanding. We learned that all of us have personal prejudices that sometimes lead to stigma. And so we have to confront those prejudices so that we can clean up our language and our attitude and be more embracing of the people around us who are having struggles. We learned about mental health diagnoses. Like I learned about the DM5, Cron, going through this course together with my friends and family at the Bridge, and understanding the process that is involved in even a diagnosis being formed, and what the process of recovery can look like. We talked extensively about the role of community. And this perhaps is the thing that the church can be involved in, that by design God has made us for, and that is to be a part of loving community around those who are struggling with mental health issues that can help them to come out of the place of isolation that Cron so aptly described. Community is powerful. God sets even the orphan in families. It's his design for all of us, right, not to be alone, but to be in supportive community. And then, of course, we even talked about self-care, not only for the person with mental health struggles, but also for those who are caregivers, those who are a part of support teams, those who are a part of the comfort community that's around. You can experience compassion fatigue, and so there's some self-care that has to happen there as well. And so we were able to look at the topic from a psychological, social, and theological perspective, again, that holistic view of mental health. And every session in this particular course was actually accompanied by a really compelling video that featured the story of an individual who was journeying through a mental health challenge as a person of faith. And I can tell you that those were so edifying to our group to recognize, again, that persons of faith, people that love Jesus, who read their Bible every day, who have a prayer life, who care about walking in holiness and righteousness, can still be struggling with some of these mental health diagnoses and issues. And that just, the acknowledgement of that alone was healing for our group, because we recognize that we're not alone, and God is not aloof to what our situation is. So in this next year, I'm planning to take our staff and our leadership community through this course so that we have a common base of understanding within our church leadership about mental health issues, so that we are positioned better to be a supportive community. And I'm hoping that this will be a platform for us to begin to build care teams where we can come around those who are walking through a dark mental health experience in their lives, and to know that they've got 5 or 6 people that they can count on that are there. And it's not 1 or 2 people, but it's 5 or 6 people that they can trust, that's a part of safe community, who understands some of the issues that they are facing and can render loving support. So I'll just quickly share with you a couple of other educational resources that I have found helpful at this site. mentalhealthishealth.us. This has got great information on the mental health continuum, and the site is laid out in a really graphically pleasing way, very user-friendly and interactive, and it helps a person kind of walk through an understanding of some of the issues that surround mental health. And then the second link that's featured there on the slide, hopeformentalhealth.com, is actually Rick Warren's ministry. He and his wife, and her name unfortunately is escaping me at the moment, but as a couple, they have responded to the loss of their son as a result of some mental health issues in his life. They've responded by initiating a hope campaign, and there are just tons of resources on this website, curricula that you can get your hands on, ideas about how you can mobilize your church. And so I just commend these 2 sites to you as you get started trying to educate yourself and wrestle with how to educate your congregations. Fourth, I just want to quickly say that we need to, as churches, to help connect those in need with trustworthy community resources. It's awesome that Cron was here today representing HopeWell, which is a ministry, a counseling ministry that he founded. This is one of the resources, for instance, in the Hampton Roads community that is available for referral by churches of those who have mental health issues that are perhaps beyond what we are capable of dealing with. In a 2000 survey, it was discovered that pastors want to help, but 80 to 90% of us feel ill-equipped to minister to people suffering with mental illness because we have received 0 to no training. And I just have to say that it's not really been a part of my educational training. It's not been a part of my formation as a pastor, and so I'm having to supplement and fill in some gaps. And so guys and ladies, we're not alone in this. And so it's okay for us to look outside of ourselves. We don't have to have all of the answers. We can begin to network with the resources that are available in our communities. And so there are good, compassionate, competent Christian counselors and psychiatrists out there, but they can be hard to find. And so I want to encourage you, reach out to some other Vanguard pastors or churches. Reach out to some chaplains or whatever your ministry context is, and begin to network and find out what are the best resources that are available in your community and build a good referral system. And then once you've got that in place, make that information available to all of your leaders, to your life group leaders, to your elder teams, or whatever the polity of your church is, to those who have responsibility leading ministries in your church. Make those referral and that system of referral available to them, knowledgeable to them, so that they can rely upon those resources as well. Not every church has the resource to build their own support groups. For instance, at the Bridge, we're not ready to take that step yet. But you know what? Through networking, I've discovered that there are other support groups to whom I can refer people. So again, I can't underscore enough the value of finding trustworthy community resources. 2 more things quickly as I wrap up here as to what we can do. We can provide opportunities for community through service. And, the journey through mental illness often robs a person of personal confidence. They begin to doubt themselves and their skills and their abilities. Again, the world's closing in around them. They begin to isolate, and they lose confidence in themselves. And so we've discovered that by inviting and creating safe places for these folks to serve within the context of the church family, defends against them developing a sense of helplessness about their lives. And so my wife, Katie, for instance, runs a regional clothing ministry out of our church. And this has become a place for some in our church family with mental illness to find a place of belonging and to serve. And one of the folks who started out volunteering on a sort of a semi-regular basis began to build confidence again in her ability, in her identity, and even a workplace identity. And she was able to join the workforce again on the basis of being able to serve within the context of her local church. And so we encourage you to, part of belonging is not just being cared for, but part of belonging is also contributing. And even the person who's going through difficult mental health issues has something to contribute. There's value that they have to the family, and they need to know that and to be encouraged in that. And then finally, I would just say, to underscore much of what Cron said today, is that if you're a caregiver, if you're a minister, if you're a pastor, if you're a church leader, don't forget to take care of yourself. One of my big takeaways from the Sanctuary course that I've so recently participated in myself was a reminder that compassion fatigue is a real thing. And so we need to take time to care for ourselves. Pastors and leaders, by virtue of our calling in life, we have a tendency sometimes to ignore our own needs while we're attempting to tend to others' needs. And so it's not inappropriate. In fact, it's essential that we take the time to care for ourselves. Otherwise, we are ministering out of our own impoverishment. And that isn't going to do anyone any good. So I just want to encourage you, things that you know, if you've been involved in church leadership for any length of time, we need to learn how to balance work and life properly. We need to find a ministry buddy, somebody that we can talk to. Cron, I so identified with what you were saying about the plight of many pastoral couples, is that they're struggling in isolation. They don't have enough people with whom they can process what's happening in their own lives. And so just having a ministry buddy, right, somebody that you can bare your soul to, is so important in terms of our own self-care. Just physical exercise, is important, and that's something that's a journey that I've been on in my own life over the last actually few years. Learning the power of exercise and improving my physical health and the impact that has on my emotional and mental life. We have to defend our time off. We all need Sabbath. We all need the opportunity to rest. The tyranny of the urgent is always going to be with us. And so we have to create for ourselves space, margin, the ability to connect with God and to allow him to pour life into us afresh. And then finally, I would just say, listen, if we're sincerely struggling, if your wife or your husband is saying, gee, you seem depressed. If those who know you well, your children, are saying, something's off. You're not tracking the way that you did before. Listen to the voices that are around you, and perhaps you need to seek mental health services if that's necessary for your life. There's no shame in doing so. In fact, it can be the very best thing, not only for your life as a leader, but you will model in ways that your words could never express to your congregation the value of caring for mental health. And so, just in closing, we can, I think, agree together that church is messy. Cron shared some scriptures today that remind us that ministry life is messy. Church is messy. And mental health issues can certainly cause it to feel all the more messy. But if we will make an effort as church communities, whether we start out with very small efforts or we grow into great efforts, everything that we do on this issue will offer new hope and practical help to those who have been suffering in isolation, many of whom have felt abandoned by their spiritual community. And our goal isn't to become some kind of perfect institution. We cannot be all things to all people. But what we can aspire to be is a place where God is glorified and people are loved and accepted, and wherever they are in their journey in life. Well, it's been a privilege to be able to share with you. I hope these things that Cron and I have shared today are helpful to you. And we're going to take just a brief 60-second break, and we'll be right back in a few moments with our discussion panel. I hope that you have been sending in some questions, because it is our heart's desire to meet you at your place of need and to respond to your questions. So thanks so much. We'll be right back with you in about 60 seconds.
Hi, folks. I'm Bobby Hill. I'm the International Director for Vanguard Ministries, and I'm thrilled and excited to tell you about an upcoming leadership conference. We call it our 2021 Annual Leadership Summit. Every year, we gather people just like you who have a heart for ministry, who have a heart for leadership, and want to influence others for the kingdom of Jesus. And we invite special guest ministries to come and speak and minister and lead us. This year, our focus is the presence and power of God. Where is that? Is it still needed? And how do we usher that into our ministries and our churches? Join us at our host church, Riverbend Church, in the North Suffolk area of Virginia. You can register today for the October 26, October 27, 2 full days of Leadership Summit. You can register at vanguardconferences.com. I hope to see you there. Yes, I hope to see you there as well. And here we are back with you now. And joining with me is this wonderful, gifted panel. You've already become introduced to Cron Gibson, and he did a good job of helping us get acquainted with him, as well as with Pastor Steve Morgan. May I also introduce you to our third panelist, and that is Adele Martelle. And Adele is a trained clinical therapist. And, one of the things I wanted to do is to have representatives on this panel that had all the answers. No, I mean representatives on this panel who would have different perspectives and likely different opinions. And I just want to say that I think that's okay for us, and I want to give you all the freedom to respond to some of the questions that have already been streaming in. And before we jump into some of those specific questions, and some of these I'll address individually maybe to you, and then others, multiple answers will be fine. Just want to take a moment to greet some of you who are watching today, and just also to encourage you to feel free to share this link later with anyone that you may think would be benefited by watching and viewing this webinar and future webinars here at Vanguard Ministries Media. So I've got friends who are watching today live from South Africa, and from Uganda, and from Ghana, and from London, and from Chiang Mai, Thailand, and from California, and from Texas, and Chicago, and Washington, D.C., Orlando, Miami, Charlotte, and I know I've missed a bunch of others. And I'm not calling any names because I'll miss some of you. So greetings to all of you who are either watching live or who will watch this at some time in the future. Feel free to stay in connection with us. Feel free, if you don't have our contact information through Vanguard Ministries, you can simply go to vanguardministries.org, or for conference information, you can go to vanguardconferences.com, and we'll follow up with you as appropriately as we can. All right, team, we've got some wonderful questions that have already come in, but I want to start with what might not be a simple one, but I think it's a good place to start. What is the difference between mental health and mental illness? Adele, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about mental health, we're actually addressing more of the holistic component that you're speaking of, although a holistic component is involved in treating mental illness as well in order for it to be treated efficiently. But mental health, we all have mental health. So when you think about health in totality, what you're thinking about is the mind, body, and spirit. And so how you nourish your spirit, your body, and your mind all impact your mental health, your emotions, how you think, how you behave, and how you interact with the world around you is your mental health. So Simone Biles gave us an amazing example of that recently with the Olympics when she prioritized her mental health, right? So, which was just phenomenal. And mental illness in particular is when we speak of something that has a bit more of a biomedical component and we think about the neuropsychology. There's absolutely a neuropsychology to mental health in general because as Cron mentioned, we see the difference in brainwave activity and neuroplasticity. But mental illness would speak to things where we see, is this nature, is this nurture, where is the etiology of this coming from? Is there a genetic component to what this person is suffering with and suffering through? And how we treat it would be different as well. So things just like traditional clinical therapy might not be applicable. We might need to introduce a medication as well.
Great answer. I just want to admit, and I think some of us who have been in ministry settings and in leadership responsibilities for, in particularly for me, for decades, I remember it was not long ago that the idea of even broaching such subjects was taboo, particularly in a public congregational or widespread church setting. And so if nothing else, I'm rejoicing over the fact that unfortunately society has contributed to us getting to this point, but whatever is necessary, I'm having more conversations today with pastors and shepherds and ministry leaders who are talking about themselves, who we're discussing things like self-care. I mean, I didn't hear anybody talking about self-care 30 years ago, and in certain circles maybe, but not broadly. And I've just thought how important it is that we all admit to some of the things that Cron and Steve were sharing earlier, and that we are all needy, and that we need Jesus, but we need one another, and we all need some help. Can I hear a big amen from the crowd on that? All right. So here's what I want to talk about, because I know in my own training, and I have a kind of a non-traditional training, and then later in life jumped through some academic hoops. But as Steve mentioned, most seminaries, most Bible colleges, most training institutions of any kind, there's a huge gap in this area. And there's other gaps we could address, but for today, we're talking about mental health and how, as ministry leaders, how are we to deal and cope with some of these things? A, for ourselves, B, to help those that we're responsible for. So one of the questions that came in was this: is it appropriate, and when is it appropriate, for pastors and church leaders to go beyond their own ability to resource, minister to, and help people with their issues? So in other words, is it acceptable? I think it's somewhat of an obvious answer, I think, to many of us, but is it acceptable to outsource? And to what degree should pastors think about that? And let's just kind of get our hands around that in general. So we'll start with you, Cron, then we'll jump over and maybe let Pastor Steve out. And Steve and I can address it from our own pastoral experience as well. What would you say to a pastor?
Well, the first thing is absolutely refer out. Purely pragmatically first, as I've pastored churches, if in that role, even though I have clinical education, if I invest the needed time with this person and this person, I will not have time to carry my shepherding and teaching responsibilities also. There's just limits that I need to own for myself first. It's actually also, I would argue, a gift to your church if you can say, I don't know how to help you with that. I know somebody who can. Let me love you. Because giving people permission simply to say, I don't know, is a gift you give them.
That's great. Good admission. Steve, how have you handled it, and what would your perspective be now from a pastoral perspective?
Yeah, so it's funny. Early in my ministry, I felt like I had to be Superman. Mm-hmm. And anyone who came in my office, somehow I needed to get the answer from God, right? With them and for them, and wore myself out. And no one can assume that role except Jesus, right? I mean, there's this. And so what I have come to now is when someone is processing a life issue with me, I'm pretty upfront right at the beginning and say, what I have to offer you is pastoral counsel. And if after meeting with me 4 or 5 times, you're not experiencing some degree of breakthrough, something isn't shifting or moving, there's some relief over this issue, then I'm going to lovingly refer you to someone outside the church who possesses a skill set and an ability that I do not have. And I have found that by communicating that up front has been really helpful, because it's difficult to communicate it on the backside. Because after meeting 4 or 5 times with someone, you've developed an intimacy, they've shared enough of their story with you that now they don't want necessarily to go and talk to someone else. They would prefer just to stay right with their pastor and talk it out. And it's not that we're not willing, but as Cron said, there are limits in the life of any shepherd. And so in order to care well for the whole body, that kind of referral needs to be there for the sake of the church, for the sake of the leader, and for the sake of the person who is working through that issue. So I have learned over time to just communicate up front. This is what I am able to do. These are the things I'm not able to do. But I do know some folks who do know what to do.
Good answer, Steve. And I'm not as good as you. So I'll do a. So what I do is one session evaluative session, where I'm trying my best to assess and evaluate, knowing that there's some tools that might also be helpful in that process. But I'll evaluate based on one session, then make a decision. Okay, are we going to have, you and me, are we going to have multiple sessions together to try to get to the bottom of this, deal with root issues, whatever, bring some restoration and healing into your life? Or is there someone else qualified in our church that can help you? And then, or thirdly, do I refer you out to a professional therapist or counselor? Now, let me just speak on a couple of practical sides of that. I want to be totally frank and honest, and with respect to my clinical friends on the platform. Pastors, I know we're all in different communities all across the U.S. and around the world, and in different communities have different resources available. And my heart goes out because I know many who are in localities that there is scant, if any, reliable, solid, Christocentric, gospel-based, well-trained counselors and therapists, available professionals that you can refer to. So, man, I'm really feeling for you today. But we are also living in a day in which online therapy support is another option that is available for people that didn't used to be. So consider that. And I would just say, be selective. I won't admit the number, but I have a limited number of counselors that I feel comfortable referring to in our entire region. And different ones for different areas. So some in the marriage arena, and some in the sexual addiction arena, and some for depression or anxiety and different disorders. I have a list. And my point is, not all counselors, even with the name Christian in front of the word counselor or therapist, are created equal. And so it's just a reality, and I hope that that's not cruel, but that's the way I approach it.
I'm going to offer a quick
Cron
comment.
or Adele, I know y'all want to comment.
Quick comment is this, that, Pastor, as you refer, don't abandon.
Yeah.
Good point.
I refer Bobby, somebody in my church. I need to stay with Bobby in the sense that, Bobby, I care, right?
Yeah,
it's
good.
not a fire and forget. And I'm a pastor, counselor, and I talk to a lot of pastors. Pastors, it's okay to want to be a part of the process or build a team around you to walk with people. And hopefully you can find a counselor that will value the local church's role in change also.
That's good. Adele?
Yeah, so you said differing opinions is okay, so I'm going to
Yes, it is.
I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I hear what you're saying, and I deeply value it. At the same time, I would like to offer a different perspective, which is, I think, unfortunately and sadly, the church has worked against itself to isolate itself when it comes to mental health, in this idea that clinicians who are not Christ-centered clinicians are somehow inept at leading their clients to whole person healing. And it's actually quite the opposite. So if the church is doing what it's functioned to do, which is to be a family of support that is emulating and supporting the heartbeat of Christ, that serves as a healing well. Then the client and the person from your congregation is getting really excellent counseling from a trained clinician who is profuse in what they do and an expert at what they do and is passionate about what they do. And to think that the spirit would be limited by them not being a Christian is actually a mistake of the church. And so therefore we've created a larger divide between us and the help that is accessible to our family.
Great observation. One of the questions, and by the way, Pastor Crystal, we are either going to need to raise the house lights or I'm unable to read that, although I may defer to my friends here who can read that from this distance. So I've got plenty of questions right here that have already come in, which this point that we're just discussing, oh, that is incredible. I'm not sure if that ruins the view online. But someone said, does every church need to have a mental health professional on staff? I think that'd be incredible if every church could have a mental professional on staff. Yeah. It's simply not realistic. Financially, organizationally, and as we know, there's churches of all different sizes. I've been blessed to lead a church that we had a formal counseling center, and with all trained professionals, 4 or 5. And frankly, what I discovered is we were overwhelmed by the needs of the community that just rushed in because we opened it up beyond our own local church. And you can imagine there's a lot of needs, and a lot of people realize that, and they're looking for trusted sources for help. So let me continue with a couple of these other questions. I think I can frame this as it was submitted. How do we open this door? I'm trying to make sure I know what this door is. How do we open this door without becoming overwhelmed with the flood? I think that's referencing simply the door to people's inner needs and mental health needs. And how do we acknowledge that publicly or personally or relationally with not then all of a sudden being overwhelmed by the flood of people? And if I could tie that in with some other questions, particularly given the pandemic environment that we are hopefully recovering from and some of the specific issues that developed then, I think a lot of pastors are freaking out right now. Like, how do I cope with, deal with what I know is out there, what I know is represented even in my congregation, and how do I approach that and open the door? So, Steve, we'll start at your end. Anybody else wants to jump in? Can.
Well, let me just say that I connect with that concern. One of the things that I've discovered as I've been making referrals over the last few months to trusted professionals in our community, that the waitlist, I don't know what you guys have been experiencing, but the backlog is tremendous. And so I just had someone the other day said, Pastor, I called for the appointment. I had called to make the referral, so they knew the call was coming. But the clinician is backed up for 3 months. And so this person is languishing, struggling, and can't get into the person who I think perhaps could help them best for 3 months. So it's a concern, because I've already admitted I don't have everything that's required to help this person. So in those cases, we offer what we have. Mm-hmm. And that is we can pray, we can provide loving community, I can listen, and those all have value. And I'm learning that I shouldn't diminish the value of those things. And at the end of the day, as people of faith, we just have to trust that God will, hold a person and care for them until the resource is available. Yeah. Beyond that, I'm not sure what else to do.
And wouldn't y'all agree that even just in spite of the backlog, and I concur, I've gotten the same responses from people, just providing a listening community, it is a huge step where people can simply open up and be honest and transparent with what's going on. So at least finding a way, even within smaller churches, where we can simply create a caring, loving, accepting environment where we can listen to one another's struggles. Do y'all agree that at least that's a step forward?
Certainly, and embedded in the question, obviously I don't know who asked it, but I think is a belief often pastors carry, and Steve, you alluded to it, and counselors are no different. Hi, I'm Jesus, let me help you, right? But even as we kind of say that, we also don't actually look at the biblical Jesus who did not heal everybody he came in contact with, who owned himself and said, I'm at my limit, and withdrew. And so I think that goes to how pastors are going to survive their own well-being and mental health also, that Jesus models things that often we skip that would be very freeing for us.
Could I add
Adele,
to that?
please.
Yeah, so I think that it's overwhelming as a psychotherapist in the community right now because our wait lists are so long, and in order to maintain our own stability, they kind of have to stay that way for a while. But I think, having been someone who's been in ministry for years as well, what I recognize here is the rush to see the revelation in because suffering is hard to watch. And And the reality is when we want to be the light so much, we push people to ignore the squinting that happens at dusk. And it's in the squinting where we have to find a new way, we have to problem solve, we have to reach out to feel our way through. And so I know this is hard on communities, I know this is hard on churches, but you're not going to be the answer, and you're not going to see the answer right away. And the answer isn't necessarily always just Jesus, it's Jesus and the suffering, it's Jesus and the dusk, and it's Jesus and the community. And so don't feel the pressure to fill the lamp oil so quickly. Sit with them longer, be present, don't abandon, create conversational communities that talk about these subjects. Then that in and of itself is incredibly healing.
I agree. Speaking of squinting, all right, where does pastoral care stop and the critical care begin? All right, I'm sorry, critical, it's clinical.
Clinical.
It's clinical, there we go. So where does pastoral care stop and clinical care begin? Cron, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, that's a complicated question.
It is.
My own grid that I sit in, I'll use this, I was at a huge continuing ed conference 5 years ago maybe, 3,500-ish practitioners, and I heard the MC say, we are now the rabbis, the priests, we're at the bedside, we're at the graveside, we're at. And so part of this question, as it asks where do we partner, is a very important question for the local church. Sometimes we don't realize when I refer over there, even to the well-meaning Christian counselor, sometimes I teach a bifurcation of what happens in my mind where Jesus touches me and mental health that isn't actually accurate because all of life is spiritual, right? So we have to pay attention to that relationship, not the same thing as saying that the clinical counselor, the trained practitioner, isn't touching things that are not overtly spiritual, but all of life is lived out of relationship in some way, and sin has marked my genes. Everyone in my family generationally has a bad right knee, right? Genetics, it's what sin marked. I'm pretty sure Adam didn't have a screwed up right knee, right? Okay, so I think the question here we separate is, as a pastor, let me wear that hat, I know I wear both all the time, I need to go, hey, these are my limits. And those limits may be, I can't carry anybody else. Those limits may be, hey, Steve, I love you and I want to help you, walk with you, but you're out my wheelhouse here. I don't want to do harm to you. Right. But my pastoral care may be, hey, I want you to go see Adele, right? And I'm going to stick with you in this, in the journey. So we create in the question kind of a false separation that I'm not sure is helpful.
That's a good point.
If I could just quickly say, I have found it helpful because I don't know that pastoral care ever stops. Exactly. I think that's kind of what you're saying, is you still maintain contact, you still maintain the caring relationship. You may not be providing the main substance of, whatever the format of healing or wholeness that's taking place, but you still have a role in pastoral care. And I have found it helpful when the clinical community has been open and congregants who I've referred have been open to this, where we can actually have conversations with one another. So I could call up Adele and say, I'm seeing something in this person that I love in my congregation that is of concern, and I want to share that with you as their clinician, just so that you're aware. Now I would never do that unless I had the permission, obviously, of the client. But that's helpful because now we're functioning as a community.
Yeah.
And I think if I could just very quickly, and I know our time's getting short, but Adele, I really appreciated what you shared about the role of a therapist, even if it's not, Christocentric. And I think what it speaks to is that healing and wholeness is found in the sense of community. In other words, a person can't just find wholeness in a relationship with their therapist. They need other relationships, right, that they're interacting with. There needs to be community. And at the same time, the community can't be the only agent of wholeness and healing. That clinician's got to be present. So it's in the community of all the diversity of those relationships where wholeness comes. And so the only caveat I would give is I have had this happen just a couple of times where a clinician viewed the person's faith as an obstacle to their wholeness,
right,
or to their journey toward wholeness.
Right.
as opposed to embracing that faith component of their life. That is awkward.
That's a little different.
Yeah, right, that's awkward. But I've only had that happen a couple of times.
Yeah. Bottom line, when you need a plumber, you really don't care whether they're a Christian or not.
Right.
You just need a plumber.
Right.
If I could summarize
There you
it
go,
that
Bob.
way. Could I drill down to pandemic-produced issues for a second? Because a number of people have written in and said, man, go through the list of conditions and psychological and spiritual, emotional, mental conditions that have been either unmasked or maybe created through the isolation that, Cron, you referenced earlier, and still to this day that people are struggling with. And Pastor Steve and I have talked, as well as some of our own local pastors in our network, that 2020 seemed to be a year of scattering and disconnection and moving, scattering, and a whole list of words that would describe it. The bottom line is there has been significant mental, emotional impact as a result of the pandemic. So can I ask each of you, maybe, we're not going to be exhaustive here, but maybe pick one condition. So you might pick anxiety, or you might pick fear. I was talking to someone this week who's still locked up in their house, and they will not leave their house. I mean, they've developed a whole phobia that has come out of this. So maybe just pick one psychological phenomena that's going on that particularly has been unmasked or revealed through the pandemic, and just speak specifically to that for a moment. And I think it might just touch on different needs. And as ministry leaders, it'll help to equip them moving forward. So whoever's first would like to go for it, just pick one each.
All right, we'll go in a row.
Yeah, let's do it.
Steve, you're last, just to be clear.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Let me take marriage, because I'm a marriage and family therapist. What I watch in the middle of this is, in general, couples that had a healthy basis for emotional connectedness. It's been a hard year and a half, 2 years, but there's an element of flourishing in their families. What the pandemic has done to families, couples where one or the other, let's say, already struggled with depression, anxiety, the pressure of it all, but they didn't have that healthy basis, it has poured miracle grow on what was actually broken already. And so what I watch in the marital and parenting and with kids is, I don't know what to do with my own distress. So that can become anxiety, that can become depression, and it begins to be a demand for the other to make me feel better, the kids to behave so that I can be okay. And there's a lostness because people are absorbed in their own brokenness and don't see a way to continue to love well, and to even how to let you love me because I'm so distressed.
Good one. Adele, you're next.
Yeah, so I would say it's a diagnosis that isn't in the DSM, but is in the ICD-9 that's recognized in the medical community. But
Another book for me to read? Oh, boy.
But those of us who have been clinicians for years have known that this exists, and it's called complex PTSD. And so Cptsd is, instead of, when you think of traditional trauma disorder, you think of an event happening, whether it's a sexual abuse or some sort of attack, or natural disaster. But what Cptsd is the accumulation of numerous experiences and perceived experiences of threat on a person's well-being and health and mental health over time, and integrated throughout that are various events that were also specific trauma events. And so this results in feelings of isolation, feelings of depersonalization, like I'm here but I'm not fully here, and so they're struggling to have healthy interpersonal relationships. And when we think about what has, and hypervigilance and all of the things that come with trauma, but it's like doubled down. So it's more pervasive in areas of people's lives, and it impacts their emotional well-being, and we treat it differently than we do a specific trauma event. And so when we think about what we've all gone through with this pandemic, and we think about what's been happening in culture and society around us with racism and with the Me Too movement and all of the things that we've experienced and been exposed to, and that various communities that are marginalized have had to be exposed and re-traumatized by, we really see the emergence of complex PTSD. And what is important for the church to value in honoring this as legitimate and helping heal it is that whole person component of treating the mind, the body, and the spirit. So creating opportunities and environments that foster that whole person healing. How is your nutrition? Obviously, I'm saying this, and you're probably thinking as a pastor, like, how can I do all of that? And it's not all on you. And I also imagine as a pastor, you may be thinking, I have that. Because you are not set apart. Although you may be sanctified, you are not set apart from Cptsd. And so recognizing that this has a reverberation in our community and looking at the little pockets of ways that we can just address all areas of a person's life to help rebuild that emotional safety and healthy relationships.
Good, very helpful. Steve?
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't know that I have much to add. I do find it helpful, new language to describe something that I've seen. It seems to me that whatever issue that a person may have been struggling with, whether it's anxiety, depression, or obsessive compulsive thoughts, the darn pandemic has just turned the volume knob up on those issues. And you know, I'm not qualified to make any diagnoses of any kind, but I feel like I have been watching people struggle with some component of social anxiety as it relates to the pandemic, and people who would otherwise normally have been fairly embracing of relationships and even physical proximity, even long beyond the time when restrictions were dropped, and you know, and obviously I know we're heading back into a season where some of those may be returning, but there's been a real hesitancy. So I don't know what to label that. I don't know if it's a social anxiety or what, yes. But there's something at work there that I can observe, though I don't have a label for it.
Yeah. It's hard to believe, but our time's up, and I just want to conclude with maybe combining a couple of the questions that have come in. Leaders asking things like, what are the absolute minimums that I can do right now? You know, and others who are saying, well, what about how do I keep boundaries for myself during this? And so I want to connect those two questions and say that I think that is a very important thing for us, all of us, who have responsibility for others during this season and future seasons, whatever comes our way, is that we focus on the fact that we must be emotionally and mentally and spiritually healthy if we're going to minister to other people. And so it begins there. And I just want to emphasize, it should be obvious, but what we're talking about today is not unspiritual. Okay? So we're talking about emotional health and mental health and general psychological health and overcoming certain diagnoses. We're not talking about things that are unspiritual, and if you dig enough in the Bible, you'll actually find references and case studies of many of these conditions. So some of you may be watching this and saying, this is just a bunch of psychobabble, and you know, y'all haven't shared enough scriptures today, or some reaction like that. I would just say to you, we have only cracked the surface, and we haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg of this subject. So we know that we have to look to the Lord. We know that we have to look to Him for answers. And so obviously I want to encourage each and every one of you, regardless of how frustrated you may be feeling, to know that. And therefore we're going to close in prayer. But let me just encourage each of you. I know that there's multiple questions. You know, sometimes when we hold a webinar, we're begging for questions. Today we have an abundance, and that makes sense to me. I would just encourage those of you who are watching the webinar now or later who would like to respond to one another, if I may just suggest creating, because I don't have all the answers, all right, and I'm not going to go and try to answer every one of your questions, just interact with one another through the chat feature, and you can respond to one another's questions, and I think that's a helpful way that you can help one another, because we have a lot of experience and a lot of great resources, even who are watching and viewing this webinar. So if I may, I'm going to ask that my fellow panelists and professionals would agree with me in prayer as we pray for everyone who is watching today and those that you care for and lead. Heavenly Father, there are moments where the pressure seems too much, and all we can do is literally, even as the psalmist cried out, as the prophets of old cried out to you. Lord, today we cry out to you for help, for resources, for insights, for wisdom that we know goes beyond sometimes our education, beyond the books that we've read. We're asking, Lord, in addition to even the pragmatic and practical and clinical professional suggestions that have been made today, we ask, Lord, that you would help us to tap into the supernatural as well, and that you would use each and every one of us to not only model a healthy life holistically, but, Lord, that you would enable us to minister more effectively. Lord, create in us a hunger to know more and to grow more and to protect ourselves, our marriages, and our families and our churches. We pray all of this in the mighty and powerful name of Jesus. Amen and amen. Thank you for joining us today for this ISI webinar, and we look forward to next quarter and offering it to you again. God bless.